population. Has written on issues also such as the causes of populism, and notably the author of White Shift, excellent book which examines the impact of demographic change on developed countries, but also on voting behaviour as well. I'm going to start by just laying out a few of the basic building blocks of where we are. In 2022, net legal migration hit 606,000, the highest figure on record, and around double the pre-Brexit rate. People voted for Brexit in 2016 on a platform of taking back control of many policy areas. Immigration was doubtless one of them, and what that exactly means, I'm sure we will get into. With immigration cited by Leave voters as the second most popular reason after democratic control and sovereignty. Then in the 2019 Conservative manifesto, there was a commitment that overall numbers would fall. Two-thirds of adults say that immigration is too high, and polling commissioned by Onward indicates that there may well be an immigration sceptic majority in as many as 75% of parliamentary constituencies. And according to YouGov, immigration is currently the third biggest issue for voters, behind the economy and health, but above the environment, which is very interesting. Nevertheless, at the same time, business leaders have been calling for more workers. There's been much reporting of a labour shortage in our newspapers, and even a former Chancellor has recently recommended that immigration should be increased as a way of controlling inflation. And there's clearly demand for workers in certain particular sectors, such as care workers. So clearly this is a very live, a very important issue. It will be salient at the next election. But I think it's very clear that it will be an ongoing question in our politics beyond whatever happens in 2024, and that is why we are interested in this topic today. I should just clarify that our discussion today is going to be focused on the legal migration regime rather than on illegality, questions around asylum, small boats, etc., though of course there will be some areas of overlap. I'm going to start by going to Damien. So net migration has been positive every year since 1994, with between 200,000 and 300,000 thereabouts per annum from 2003 onwards. Clearly, there is some kind of gap, a very large gap between what public policy is currently delivering and what the electorate say they want. But obviously, there are wider prevailing economic and public policy considerations as well. Now, you obviously had experience right at the coalface when you were inside Whitehall. Would you talk us through your perception of where kind of the immigration discussion is at the moment? What are the ups, what are the downs, and what are the challenges with getting to grips with this question from a public policy perspective?
Sure, thank you very much, and thanks to Onward for, I mean, not just this, but the whole discussion about the future of conservatism, which is extremely relevant. And I should say I feel slightly awed that all the academics whose work I used to read before concluding as Immigration Minister that my job was impossible on the panel with me. I want to start on an unexpected literary note by quoting Alexander Pope, who famously said, for forms of government let fools contest, whate'er is best administered is best. And quite a lot of the secret to immigration policy is about dull administration and making it work, because it doesn't matter what principles you apply and whether you come up with marvellous evidence-based policy. If the system doesn't work, then nothing will go right, and governments will look incompetent, and people will be angry in the way that they do get up and down. But immigration goes up and down, that salience list you just quoted, and it's quite high at the moment because clearly the government is not achieving what it wants to do. And I think this is directly, as I say, relevant to today's debates. You rightly say let's concentrate on legal immigration and what the government is trying to do, rather than the asylum issue. But the asylum issue is a good illustration of that very salient point, because if you speeded up asylum processing, then you would have fewer problems. And I think that should be the ministerial priority, more frankly than passing new legislation. The immigration system was completely out of control between sort of 2003 and 2010, and as shadow immigration minister, which I was for 5 years, I used to taunt the government constantly with, if passing laws, they passed an immigration law every year, if passing laws actually solved the immigration crisis, then we would have the best immigration system in the world. And I'm afraid government has got slightly back into this habit of passing a new immigration bill every year, expecting that somehow this will solve the problem, and it doesn't. And I'm afraid that's an eternal truth. And the other eternal truth is if you've got people coming across the channel illegally, the only way to solve it is to cooperate with the French. They used to come across in the backs of lorries, and they don't anymore. The reason they're coming on small boats, which is more dangerous even than the backs of lorries, is that we stopped them by shelling money out at the French. So they put X-ray machines in Calais, basically, and that minimised that kind of process. But as you say, 600,000 is the current legal migration level, net migration level, which is way too high. When I left the immigration bit of the Home Office, it was 163,000 and falling. And we were constantly jeered at, well, you haven't hit your 100,000 target. I think any immigration minister, for as far ahead as the eye could see, would bite your arm off at net migration at 163,000. I mean, there are various points I should make as an introductory thing. You can't redefine your way out of it. A lot of people say, well, let's just take students out, because students are only here for a bit. Apart from the fact there is an international definition of migration, which is somebody who moves to another country for more than a year. I think if any government said, we've cut immigration by 200,000 by saying that students don't count, they would be laughed out of court. That would be seen to be fiddling. And I think and the other half of that is that if you talk rightly about the job shortages, it seems to me that one of the areas that has been hugely successful over decades is the seasonal agriculture worker scheme, and partly because it brings people over for less than a year, so it doesn't actually count in immigration statistics. And a lot of the ways we could address what are genuine labour shortage in industries like hospitality, certainly in that sort of industry where you quite get a lot of youngish workers who would quite like a year in this country, is to have one-year visas for people for those kind of shortage occupation industries. But the main thing, and I suspect Alan will expatiate on this better than me, is that we need to have fewer shortage occupations. So we're not asking committees to define shortage occupations on which we're allowed to bring in hundreds of thousands of workers from overseas, because these are jobs that British people won't do. People won't do jobs if they're underpaid and undervalued. If you pay people more in things like care and value them better and give them a career structure, then funnily enough, I think more Brits would want to work in those sorts of industries. So that's actually the other side of the coin, that you can be as tough as you like in your rhetoric, but actually, unless you've got the right people to fill the right jobs, then you're going to have an immigration problem. So as one final point I'll make about politics and targets, which is, as I say, the 100,000 target that we famously had, which we never met, was actually, contrary to popular rumour, a political success. If you look at the 2015 election, then I think the Conservative Party had a 36-point lead on immigration over the Labour Party. And we're now behind, I observe, as a party on immigration. And that's because even though we hadn't hit the 100,000 target, we were clearly making strenuous efforts which were reasonably successful at getting down towards that level. I don't think anyone sensible thinks that you are going to change immigration numbers radically overnight. But if you are seen to be doing practical things combined with realistic speeches, then that's a lot better than having tougher and tougher rhetoric and less effect in practice. So I would dial down the rhetoric and dial up the effectiveness of the policy.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you raised the issue of practical policy levers, because I want to circulate back to that a little bit later in the discussion. But just on the post-Brexit migration regime, I'm going to come over to you, Madeleine. From your work, obviously you've got great expertise in this area, directing the Migration Observatory at Oxford. Could you, for us, just paint a picture of how you see the post-Brexit migration system, the points-based system? How is it working? From your perspective, is it working? Are there things that aren't working? And as a result of it, what are the key trends in both EU migration non-EU migration, skilled and unskilled. Why have we got this very high number, and how is that composed?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, whether it's working, I think, depends on what you expected it to do, and not everyone had the same vision of that. The sort of broad picture in terms of what's happened over the last few years, obviously when free movement ended, we used to have this very liberal regime for EU citizens, and that was brought to an end, and now everyone is in the same, non-EU and EU citizens are all in the same regime, which is much more restrictive than what EU citizens faced, but more liberal than what non-EU citizens faced for most of the 2010s. Now, there are many different types of migration that are contributing at the moment to the overall numbers. One of the big reasons that we saw really high numbers in 2022 by historical standards is these unusual factors, that unusually high numbers of people from Ukraine and also people leaving Hong Kong under the Hong Kong BNO status holder route. So that contributed to the increase, but it's definitely not the only thing. We also then saw an increase in the number of skilled workers coming. And that's primarily in the health and care sector, which I suspect we'll be talking about more because that's been a really important driver of skilled migration. And then the third one is an increase in international students. Partly, I think there's an interesting debate about how much that's a result of policy. The regime for international students is a bit more liberal before with the reintroduction of post-study work, but the numbers are much higher than they were when we had a sort of actually quite similar regime about 10 or 15 years ago. So you've got this odd combination of factors that led to higher levels of immigration, not all because of the post-Brexit immigration regime, although there were some liberalisations that are part of that, like the extension of the skilled work visas to care workers. In terms of the net number, I think it is reasonable to assume that even if policy didn't change at all, the numbers will come down over the next few years, partly because we don't have as many people coming in from Ukraine as we did in the past. So the weekly figures of Ukrainians are a small fraction of what they were in early 2022. And also because we expect, at least if we see historical data or anything to go by, that there will be an increase in emigration of international students. In the past, the large majority have eventually returned home, but not typically for 1 to 3 years. So the expectation then is that between now and 2025, the emigration, particularly of international students, will pick up. With slightly lower immigration, even without a change in policy, you would expect to see the numbers come down. Although exactly where they come down to is difficult to predict.
Mm. And on that question of skills, one of the arguments that one does here for the necessity of high economic migration is that there's a skills deficit, or there are certain skills which do need to be acquired overseas or imported. Given what's actually playing out at the moment, and given the rules as defined within the skilled work visa, do you think that particular mechanism is delivering what we need from it? Is it really delivering skilled workers into the economy, or are there problems with it?
I think, most of the way that the immigration system defines skill is primarily based on the length of training that is required. And most of the jobs that people are coming into would be considered skilled. They would require often a university degree, but sometimes training short of a university degree. There are the main exemption, and this actually now concerns a relatively large number of people, is care workers, which under any classification is not going to be qualified as a skilled, under any sort of statistical classification, won't count as a skilled job in the sense that you only require a few days of training in order to be able to do that work. I think that the big story here is the health and care sector. I think demand. There has been something of an increase in demand in the private sector roles, but not that big. The reason that there's been an increase in demand for skilled worker visa is people coming in as care workers, doctors, and nurses. And I think this gets us into a debate. It's interesting because back in February 2020, I think, when the government put out the policy statement on the post-Brexit immigration system, there was this relatively stark statement that, employers are going to have to adjust. And what I think has been interesting is that where there's been most reluctance to adjust has actually been in the bits of the labour market that the government controls. So in health and care, where in the case of the NHS, the government effectively controls both training and the pay and conditions in the NHS, and then in care, effectively the funding model is really important for determining the pay rates of workers. And I think there are strategies you could envisage that would, that might have an impact on reducing demand for overseas workers, but they would be expensive, and it would require doing things like really addressing the funding model for social care, which is something that for other reasons has been politically very, very difficult. So I don't think it's inevitable that you have to have these levels of migration, but I think if you don't, you have to think about the consequences and the trade-off and which other areas of policy need to be engaged.
Sure. Well, before we get into the question of methods for reduction, if indeed reduction is what we want to do, I just want to come over to you, Alan, on this question of a skills shortage or a labour shortage, because there's a lot of discussion about this. It often gets spoken about as though it's just a kind of an assumed fact, but you were interviewed in the FT quite recently talking about this question of whether there in fact is a labour shortage, or is it just in fact that there are certain jobs being advertised by employers which British workers don't want to do at the salary and the conditions being offered, and it's not really right to talk about a labour shortage, yet many business leaders are using those terms. Could you just talk a bit about your take on that?
Yeah. I mean, I as a sort of an economist would say, well, when we say there's a shortage of labour, we're sort of saying that the demand for labour is running ahead of the supply of labour. So I think it's not surprising that people then think, well, a solution to that is let's increase the supply of labour through immigration to close that gap. But I think there are, you need to think about it a little bit more than that. So now you might think about the labour market as a whole. There's a sort of generalised shortage, that the labour market is pretty tight. And in that case, I think it's sort of, my view is that immigration is not a solution to generalised shortage. And the problem is that, yes, more immigration of workers increases the supply of labour, but as those immigrant workers work and earn money and spend money, they're simultaneously increasing the demand for labour as well, and that's more or less in balance. But there is another side to that coin, which is that in a recession, it's equally not the case that lower immigration is the solution to unemployment. So a recession is going to be the demand running ahead of the supply. And I think one of the things you see is people tend to come from their view on immigration first, for or against, and then adopt inconsistent positions on what we should do to immigration in booms and recessions. So I think my view is that it's neither a solution to a tight labour market or a solution to unemployment. But then we come, I think, to the sort of shortages in specific sectors, and I think then it's really important to try and think about the question, well, why is there a shortage? And very crudely, there are two possible reasons. Firstly, there aren't enough people in the UK who are able to do this job. And secondly, there aren't enough people who want to do the job. And I think a lot of the discussion we have tends to emphasise the former, but actually it's the latter much more of the time. And I think we overestimate the former partly because our immigration system is built around skills. So in order to get access to the system, employers are always going to be talking up the skills. And secondly, when employers say, well, we've got shortages, they're not going to say because our pay and conditions are really terrible. That is just not really going to be what happens. So a lot of this is really, these sort of shortages are about really poor paying conditions. That's what they're about. So they cannot compete, these sectors cannot compete in the open labour market. And really what they're asking for is sort of ring-fence supplies of labour, which, I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but just be very clear about what you're doing. If you do that, I think you'll be detaching that part of the labour market forever because there's sort of no way back. You'll be institutionalising it. And there may be arguments for it. You're probably going to get what they produce sort of cheaper than you otherwise would because the pay and conditions are going to be permanently worse. But at the same time, you're going to have, it probably isn't going to be very good for people who are working in those sectors. So I think a lot of it, what are called skill shortages are really about poor paying conditions.
Do you think there's been a wage compression effect as a result of migration in certain sectors? Because that's something that's often disputed.
I think no one has really, to my mind, managed to come up with any very compelling evidence of any large effect of immigration on wages, good or bad. I think at the bottom end of the labour market, that's partly because we've had the minimum wage, we've raised the minimum wage higher than average earnings. And so I think a lot of the sectors that are sort of reporting shortages are ones which actually, they're not very nice jobs. And so they have to pay above the minimum wage. And so they actually end up paying the minimum wage. So if you're kind of working, in a pub or something, it may be a minimum wage work. That's a lot more fun than working on the night shift in an abattoir, even though can be a minimum wage job as well. So I think it's those sectors which really, the minimum wage has been really important in sort of meaning there hasn't been any bad effect on wages. But I think some sectors which are sort of not less than appealing jobs have found it easier to sort of, continue to pay minimum wages.
There have been some specific sectors where there have been some significantly above inflation pay rises, like HGV drivers and that sort of thing. I mean, some of the reporting increases of 20%, 30% in pay. Is that a post-Brexit thing? Is that due to changes in migration patterns? And what might be the cause of that?
I think in HGV drivers, I think we've got some reasonably good evidence that salaries did go up. But I think that emphasises, that's the trade-off. That has helped to alleviate shortages. There are many fewer reports around this. Other things have helped as well. They've trained more people and things like that. So it's not just that. And obviously that's great if you're a driver, but at the same time it's made driving and the costs of moving stuff around kind of more expensive. That probably feeds into the costs of other things. Those are the trade-offs that you've got to. But to sort of try and decide where you want to be, as Madeline said, it depends what you are trying to achieve. But I think in sectors like hospitality, the evidence that pay has gone up isn't really very strong at all. I mean, I think our earnings data is not very good. But the evidence suggests it's actually in the highest paying sectors where the wage inflation is highest, not in these lower paying sectors.
There's a final one from me on this topic before we go over to Eric. I'm going to ask a cheeky one. If you are a lower paid, lower skilled domestic British worker, do you think the large scale economic migration we've had since, say, 2003 has been net positive or net negative for you, on balance?
On balance, I think it was pretty much a wash. But I mean, I think the arguments that there were big costs, I don't kind of agree with that. But the other side of it, that there were huge big benefits as well, I don't think there's very much evidence for that. And of course, politically, that's difficult. I mean, you can't really campaign on we should have an open immigration regime because it makes no difference to you. That's really hardly going to be a sort of make it into anybody's manifesto, I suspect. So that's sort of my view. I think the issues that people have is that they somehow felt their concerns weren't being addressed, and somehow the bandwidth of government and so on is going on other places and other people, and it was that sense of neglect that was the root of this more than any effect on objective sort of material economic.
So GDP as a whole addition, because there's more people obviously, but GDP per capita, much of a muchness would be your view.
Yeah, I don't think immigration has had very much effect on GDP per capita because immigrants actually aren't a massive share of the total labour force, and on average they're not very, very different from the Brits, and so they just don't really make that much difference to GDP per capita.
Great. Let's go over to Eric. So I want to make sure we've got enough time to talk about practical policy steps and also for audience questions. So Eric, moving on perhaps a little bit from the economic side of this, could you, obviously you've done a lot of work on the politics of this, and you've done a lot of opinion polling on this subject and many others as well. How do you see this issue politically, given that we are now months effectively away from a general election? This is one of the few areas in which the Tories have been leading, but perhaps no longer, or where that's falling away. It seems as though this is something of profound importance to many, many voters, but perhaps certain kinds of voters more than others. And you've spoken about age on this sort of thing. Talk us through the politics of this.
Yeah, I guess the first thing to realize about attitudes to immigration is it's really not the economy, stupid. It's really about psychology, culture. If you take two questions, for example, is it more important for a child to be well-mannered or considerate? The difference in, it sounds like the same question, the difference in your view on that is going to explain a significant chunk of your view on immigration. Even more so, things in Britain were better in the past. If you strongly agree with that, almost 8 out of 10 would agree with the state of people who say things were better in the past. Almost 8 out of 10 would say immigration should be reduced a lot. People who strongly disagree with that, it's only about 1 out of 10. So that's giving you a sense of what's underlying immigration attitudes. But then what we have is the numbers. Numbers tend to drive salience. Not a one-to-one relationship, but there's a strong relationship there. So what happens is if numbers go up, you're a voter who says immigration should be reduced, but instead of immigration being your number 5 issue or number 4 issue, it's your number 1 or 2 issue. And that's what was behind Brexit. It was what was behind the European populist right. So what we're in a situation now is where the numbers are going up again and salience is rising again. So if you just take, say, Conservative voters or Leave voters, the top 3 importance of immigration to them is almost 3 times where it was at the pit of the pandemic. So the pandemic really drops the salience of immigration because people are worried about the economy and about health. Now that those things are starting to fade, immigration's coming back, and of course the numbers are high. What that then means is we've got rising salience of immigration, and rising salience of immigration is the number 1 predictor also of support for populist right parties. So we have now got demand conditions for the populist right to re-emerge as it did prior to the Brexit vote. So salience of immigration amongst Tory voters prior to the Brexit vote was sort of about 70% in the top 3. It's now about 60%. So it's close to where it was prior to the Brexit vote. The question now is how the political system responds. I think that what happened is we forget that Johnson trusts the sort of what I will call Singapore-on-Thames liberal Brexiteers took over the movement when the Tories came into office in 2019. Even though 40% of Brexit voters, immigration is their number 1 issue, for Tory MPs, very few of them, immigration is their number 1 issue. And that disconnect is what we're seeing playing out now. The Tory MPs, the party actually liberalised immigration, not just because there were pressures in cabinet, but because most of them are economic liberals first, and if they are culturally conservative, it's second. And so they prioritized the economic liberalism, and that dovetailed well with the pressures they were getting from business to liberalize. And so you saw Johnson liberalizing the minimum wage thresholds, the requirement to advertise jobs to British workers first. You saw Truss trying to do trade deals with India to have free movement, etc. These are just signals of how liberal, even under the Brexiteer elite, how liberal they were compared to their voting base. So that opens up space for populism, and I would suspect we're going to see, well, the demand conditions are there. The question is, who is it going to be? How's it going to express itself?
So what do you think are the causes of people having a critical or negative response towards immigration? Obviously, one of those is, at the very least, a perception of competition for jobs, effect on wages. Obviously, there's complexities with the economics of that. So that's one, but what are the other factors out there? Why is it such a big issue for so many voters?
Yeah, I don't think actually economics is central. So it's partly reflecting what Alan said. Your view on immigration kind of comes first for psychological, cultural, ideological reasons, and then you see problems through that lens. So if you take an issue like pressure on public services is a problem, if you ask Brexit voters, you just put it like that, they'll give it about a 50 out of 100 as a problem. At least they did in a survey I ran a number of years ago. If you say immigration putting pressure on public services, it jumps up to like 70, 75. So it's actually can't be the case that the part of the problem of public services pressure due to immigration is larger than the problem itself. So I think that's kind of an indication of what's driving it is fundamentally ideological, psychological. But then the key thing is the numbers, because that then increases the salience, partly mediated by the media. And so I guess I see this fundamentally as a cultural issue. And so hence, I don't see this, yes, it is an economic issue in that you have to sort of address the drivers of economic needs for immigration. But fundamentally, this is a sort of realignment issue in which the politics of Western countries is shifting away from necessarily that sort of economic left-right redistribution versus market divide to a more open-closed, if you like, divide over cultural attitudes. And just to give you an example of, if you take the view that immigration should be increased, in the United States, for example, that view took off from 2016 to the point where something like 60 or 65% of white liberal Americans said immigration should be increased in this. Never, ever has that view been expressed in the past. And I think that just sort of tells you this is seen as a moral issue by particularly left-wing voters. And I think for those on the conservative side, it is very much tied up with their view things in Britain were better in the past. We don't want things to change so fast ethno-culturally, culturally. That, I think, is what ultimately underlies this.
Do you think that historically Labour voting communities, which may have moved over to the Tories in 2017, 2019, have got a more sceptical view? Is there evidence of that?
Yeah, there is, in the sense that there's a correlation, let's say, between thinking things were better in the past, say, not having university education and living in those communities. I don't want to overstate, though, the kind of somewhere anywhere thesis, in the sense that this psychological divide actually runs through university educated people, working class. So you've got liberal working class people, you've got conservative university educated people. But the education divide has become more important in the politics of all Western nations, and particularly on the immigration issue. So the cultural axis, the cleavages that around culture have risen in salience, and the economic cleavages have declined. The class redistribution cleavage has declined in salience amongst the voters. What I think we can say, however, amongst political elites, particularly in the Conservative Party, the economic cleavage is very much more important for Conservative MPs than for their voters. And I think that's one of the reasons you're seeing this sort of dissonance, really, that's leading to an opening for people like Farage now, is because the MPs are really not on the same page as their voters.
So there's a gap between where many voters are and where the Conservative Party is on immigration, in the same way as you've suggested there is on, say, free market economics or economic liberalism. It's kind of, it's like a gulf issue between the parliamentary party, we're here to talk about the Conservative side of things, and,
right,
and the country at large. Would you say that?
Yeah, so the MP surveys, for example, that Tim Bale and UK and EU ran, I mean, they showed the typical Tory MP is quite far to the right of the typical Tory voter on economics and very far to the left on culture. And actually that's a pattern you see across Europe. There's been studies on this as well. Elites who are drawn into politics, even on the right, tend to be liberal on the cultural issues. And that offers an opening, really, for those populist politicians that are willing to go into the kind of culturally conservative zone where many party MPs are not willing to go.
So do you think this is existential for the Tories?
I do think so, yes. I mean, I think that I suppose the question is what happens to that third party zone, right? I mean, if Farage does come into politics, now you do need a charismatic figure, or it takes a number of cycles. These populist parties can start very small. They have to build up over a number of cycles, like UKIP did, for example. But a well-known figure like Farage can, or a Wilders or I don't know, a Haider in Austria can galvanize people quickly. So these populist parties, their support jumps up and down very quickly based on their leadership. But yeah, I think that the Tories, if they don't get a hold of these cultural realignments and realize who their voters are, then yes, they're going to be in the wilderness. Yeah.
Let's take it as a given that this is going to be an existential issue for perhaps both major parties or all parties in the UK, certainly in the future, if not in the 2024 election. It might be useful to have a bit of a discussion about what could practically be done if a party were to set out to say, okay, we need to do something with this model, we need to reduce economic migration. It's not enough to just emphasise the border and the illegal side of things. We've got a certain system in place, the points-based system that we have at the moment. I'm going to go back to you, Damien, because obviously you've been on the inside of Whitehall, you've held the portfolio for this. If you were charged with, the Prime Minister says, look, we've got to do something about this, it's not going to come down to net zero, as it were, but we've got to get it seriously down from 600,000, from 500,000. What are the challenges and what are the levers we can start pulling? You've said, legislation is not always the way to go.
I mean, first of all, I disagree with the thought that this is existential. What's existential is the economy. I mean, as you said, this
Yeah,
is
it's
the
number
third
one.
most important issue.
Yeah.
The most important one is the economy. If you get the economy right, then you get a huge amount of tolerance about every other policy you do. If you get the economy and the health service right as a Tory government, then you're cooking, and it's fine. However, to answer your question directly, I agree with Madeline actually that the figures having peaked in the past 18 months or so are very likely, even if nothing happens, to come down. There are not, God willing, going to have to be another 200,000 Ukrainians displaced. We have taken in a lot of the Hong Kong people to whom we owe a responsibility in already. So those numbers will, as it were, disappear out of the figures. So I think
it's a compositional thing there.
Next year's net figure will, whatever we do, be less than this year's. And I think there are things you can do, but quite a lot of what you do on legal migration, you will, in the short term, be damaging the economy. And you have to accept that trade-off. That if you just say, OK, fine, we are going to grant half the number of visas for work of whatever type next year than this year, then you will find more pubs closing on Mondays or not opening longer hours. You will find more problems in the care system. And so both in, if you like, moral terms, in the way we're conducting our public services, but also just in straightforward economic terms, you will reduce economic activity. Now, in the long term, as I say, absolutely, we should attempt to fill those jobs with some of the 3 million working age but economically inactive people we've got now. We have this weird situation where we have very low unemployment numbers, but still millions of people who could be working who are not working, a lot of whom stopped work during the pandemic and haven't come back. A lot of them have disabilities, including mental health issues, which may well have been exacerbated or indeed caused by the pandemic. So there is a weird, what used to be called a sort of pool of labour, but it's not among the unemployed, the sort of mass unemployment that we saw in the 1980s. It is of people who do not claim to be unemployed, but who nevertheless are not working. And as I say, in the long term, it will be much better for our society in all sorts of ways if those people worked, if people probably worked longer and stopped dreaming of an early retirement and things like that. All of that would be good. But in terms of the next election, if that's the way you're framing the question, then anything, pulling a lever now would probably reduce economic activity, might well precipitate a recession, and that, I think, would do more damage to the Conservative Party than taking a risk on the sort of culture wars that Eric was talking about.
Sure. Just before coming to Madeline, because I want to get your thoughts on the visa regime, I'm just going to bring you in again, Alan, on this question of on this question of we keep coming back to it, don't we, of labour force and labour supply. Some people say, well, as Damien says, we've got economically inactive people in this country that could possibly be unlocked at either end of the labour market, and/or having an economy reliant on high levels of net migration leans against the sorts of investment and innovation in things which might increase labour productivity, which might be less reliant on that. Is there any merit in either of those arguments, or is it unrealistic, or what is the picture there?
I think, the statistics I feel are kind of really quite messed up at the moment. Like, our main labour force survey was really disrupted by the pandemic, and because the ONS is transforming it to a new way of collecting it, I kind of slightly worry that a lot of conclusions that are based on it may not be entirely reliable. The response rate now is, I think, down to 25% on it. If you look at, say, HMRC data on workforce jobs, employment is clearly well above pre-pandemic levels. I think it supports the view that actually the labour market is generally very, very tight, not that there's been a big fall in labour supply. Even if you look at sectors like hospitality, it's very clear if you look at the data, there's a big fall in the number of EU workers employed in it. but actually the number of non-EU workers has subsequently risen by more than the fall in EU workers. So hospitality employment is now above pre-pandemic levels. I think you've got to be kind of quite careful about, there are narratives out there which I'm not sure always sort of survive looking at, you know, what's actually happening. I mean, you know, so I think that we've got to be, you know, I think our labour market is very, very tight at the moment. It's, you know, that's why, and we've got a very tight labour market like the US has had, but we've also got the energy price shock that Europe has had, and that's why we've got the worst problem with inflation, basically. And immigration's really very, very little to do with any of that.
So I'll come over to you now, Madam, because we were talking earlier a bit about, you know, what could be done to make a dent in this, beyond, you know, the idea that it will naturally fall as these kind of compositional effects and circumstantial effects do start to fall away. If you were given a red pen and you could start sort of improving upon, shall we say, as an academic exercise, of course, the current work visa regime, the points-based system, and someone said, you know, this needs to be brought into more of an equilibrium, what are the levers that you could look to?
Yeah, so I should say, I mean, I think ultimately these are all political choices, and I'm actually the ultimate technocrat. You know, I have to sit on the fence on all of these things because I actually struggle to, you know, commit to anything on politically. But I think, I mean, so the sort of macro point to make is that the political challenge here is that that people support on the aggregate the idea of lower migration. There's very strong support for that in opinion polls. But actually, when you look at the individual components of migration, you tend to have higher level. And many of the largest groups that make up overall migration are actually quite popular. And so I think that actually that dynamic creates a little bit of an incentive for cakeism, for people to talk about the idea of reducing migration, but not actually to introduce policies that would do it. So if you, you know, I'm going to sidestep the political issue and say, okay, if your goal is to reduce migration, then you know you have to look at all of those components and see what you want to cut. Now, obviously, on Ukraine, probably it's the case that that program could remain in place, and not many people will come through it in the future. Although you know, it depends on the course of the war in Ukraine. Probably similarly for BNOs, although it's difficult to predict. So that effectively leaves you with the next two biggest categories are work and study. Now, international students, because most of them go home, they you know, many of them are not contributing in the long run to net migration, but obviously some of them do, and will stay in the UK. And the government has chosen to take relatively liberal choices on students, allowing people post-study work rights, which doesn't mean that they can stay in the UK forever, but does make it easier for them to then move into the work visa system. So that then leaves you. So I think, you know, getting rid of post-study work. It's very difficult to predict whether that would make a big difference in net migration in the long run. I suspect it would make some difference because people would find it harder to get that foothold in the labour market. But yeah, it's very difficult to say in advance. So then it leaves you with the work visa system as the next biggest category. And I think, you know, the types of levers that I mean, there's the skills threshold, the salary threshold. Again, and you know, any changes that you would make to those will have trade-offs. If you increase the salary threshold, that will primarily affect the sort of middle-skilled jobs that have become newly eligible for the immigration system. But the big question, I think, on work visas is going to be health and care. And I think care is particularly interesting because it is, I don't like to use the word shortage because I think often it's misused in public debate, but you know, there has really been a shortage of workers in care, and there's you know, been fundamental problems in that labour market. It's very easy to get care jobs if people are willing to do them because of the difficulties that employers have had recruiting. And so I think there's a really difficult political choice to be made about, you know, if your goal is to reduce skilled work visas, you know, that's one of the biggest single categories at the moment, people coming in into care jobs. And you know, there's a reason that they're coming in, and it's because, as Alan said, it's because of the poor paying conditions in care that has made it so difficult for care employers to recruit people effectively at the minimum wage or very slightly above. So I think, in all of these cases, it's possible to make more restrictive choices, but then you have to think about, okay, well, how are you going to deal with some of the consequences of those? Is it possible to fix the funding problems in social care? That's been a very long-standing issue.
Some people have suggested that the salary threshold is insufficiently high relative to the average wage and/or is insufficiently sectorally targeted, and you could make it much less of a kind of a generalised criterion. Do you think there's merit in either of those arguments, or would it be feasible to make those changes?
The salary thresholds, the one that gets a lot of press is what's now the 26,200, but it is actually sectorally targeted in the sense that there's a different salary threshold for each occupation within the immigration system. I think, it's very difficult to say what the right answer is. It partly comes back to this question that Alan raised, well, how liberal is your overall policy? A lot of the impacts of these kind of small tweaks are probably not going to be huge. Remember also that we're talking with the skilled work visa system, we're talking maybe 13% of long-term non-EU immigration into the UK last year. So most people are not coming through the skilled work visa system, and that obviously sort of influences how we think about its impact on the labour market. But yeah, by international comparison, it's certainly not a high threshold. There are countries that have higher thresholds. There are countries that have lower ones. So I think this is really something that a technocrat like me can't give you the answer to, I'm afraid.
Eric, what, if anything, can or should be done?
Well, I think part of this is that a lot of the benefits are short-term in terms of sectoral needs, and a lot of the costs are longer-term, including, by the way, the aging of immigrants, but particularly pace of cultural change, which is something that is very important to a lot of populist voters. And it is a choice, it's true. And it is true that a lot of voters have a cakeist attitude. I think that shows up on the surveys. But ultimately, governments do have to make a choice. Now, they've consistently chosen to go the route of, I would argue, of liberalizing immigration, taking those short-term benefits, including to the health of the Treasury and satisfying various lobby groups, instead of trying to address the numbers issue. And of course, it's the case that the economy is the most important issue almost all the time. That's absolutely true, but it's also very complicated with a lot of moving parts. The immigration part of it is an extremely small part. It's not clear to me that would make a great deal of difference. And so it comes down to political will and political choices. And up to now, the Conservative Party, for example, has taken the more business liberal path rather than the culturally conservative path. That's fine, that's a choice, but ultimately I think their voters are not, or a lot of their voters are not there. And the trends are moving in a restrictionist direction insofar as the salience of this issue is rising, which it tends to do when the salience of other issues such as health and the pandemic fall. So going forward, I just don't think electorally for the Conservative Party to pursue that sort of business liberal strategy, I'm just not sure that's going to pay off for them.
So is it a lack of belief that it's something that needs to be done that's an issue for the Conservative Party? Is it just a lack of political will? It's too difficult for the sorts of reasons we've been talking about, or is it more to do with kind of the deep institutional structure of Whitehall? The kind of the interests of the Treasury. Things like the OBR, obviously migration affects things like the debt to GDP ratio and those kinds of calculations. Right. Which of those do you think it is, or is it some combination of the three?
It is a combination, but I don't think it's the case that the Parliamentary Party is pushing for restriction and is being resisted by the civil service. I don't think that's the case. I think there's actually, it comes down to priorities and trade-offs, and I just think for a lot of MPs, reducing immigration is a low priority compared to anything economic. And so in that sense, they dovetail quite well perhaps with what the opinions are within Treasury. So I don't think there has been a ton of friction. And you can see that where there is friction is perhaps within number 10 and within the cabinet. But certainly I don't see this as necessarily a civil service issue. I think it's been that a lot of the intake, a lot of the MPs are coming from a generation or a mindset that is more 1980s Thatcherite economic liberal and much less populist national conservative, for example. And I think ultimately it's not sustainable. That will have to resolve itself with the electorate some way. I don't, for example, think that culturally liberal, economically liberal, sort of what we might say country club conservatives who have very liberal-ish attitudes on culture. I don't think that kind of group is large enough, and I don't think that there are enough people who are culturally liberal that will vote Tory. I don't think that is a potential strategy for the Conservative Party to win. If they're going to win, they're going to have to reach the red wall. They're going to have to reach that sort of working class, more culturally conservative vote. And going for the kind of business liberal high immigration strategy won't do that.
Just before we go to audience questions, I'm just going to give each of you the opportunity to sort of have a last word. And here at the Future of Conservatism project at Onward, we are looking at the future of our politics beyond the next election. So we're looking to the medium and to the long term and thinking about the really deep currents and deep trends and deep challenges in our politics and in public policy. So starting with you, Damien, if there's one thing that you would want to communicate or one thing that perhaps we've overlooked that would be coming down the track for a government that was in power in the 2020s, after 2024, I mean, what would that be in relation to the issue of immigration? What's the big thing that's going to have to be grappled with? And perhaps there might have to be a conversation with the electorate over.
The most important thing of all is productivity. If we get productivity up, then individual domestic workers become richer and become therefore more able to move around the economy, and therefore you probably have less demand for immigration. But much more importantly than that, that's the way to national prosperity. And our failure post-pandemic to bring our productivity back up, largely in the public sector, it should be said, is the central issue facing us, as well as new things coming down the track like AI. But if I can just cheat and slightly come back on the point about the culture, should the Conservative Party become more populist? As long as we have a first-past-the-post political system, and therefore as long as each of the major parties need to be coalitions, then actually a sort of populist solution would be fatal. And even Conservative voters who are, if you like, attracted by the populist agenda will at a general election think, OK, I could vote for X party, whatever the sort of far-right party is calling itself at that election. But a lot of them always decide, I'm not going to do that because I don't want to let Labour in. And there will come a point, maybe, where that becomes more difficult. But it is absolutely the case that if you go for that section of the electorate, it is not big enough to deliver you a government. So you are condemning yourself to permanent opposition. Populism in a first-past-the-post system does not work. Ask Jeremy Corbyn.
Alan.
Well, first of all, I sort of agree with Damien that the central economic problem we have is about low productivity growth. And that's actually got very little to do with immigration. I think sometimes immigration is neither the cause of our problems nor the cure for them, basically. It's just not that. But I think on immigration, what I would say is that I think voters don't like the feeling when it's out of control, that's quite important. Numbers can be quite high as long as they feel it's sort of controlled. And I think the challenge there will be, even though we're not meant to talk about it, will be asylum seekers. And I think the UK has always had less than in some sense, its share of asylum seekers within Europe because the Channel, I think, was perceived as a barrier. And it's become apparent it's not the barrier that anybody thought it was. And the UK just hasn't come to terms with the fact that it is going to have a higher share of European asylum seekers than it has historically had. The government does not have any kind of a policy to address what is happening now. I mean, it has a non-policy at the moment, is my view. Rwanda cannot work, will not work. Administratively, they've allowed this backlog to rise. I've no idea why anyone allowed that to happen. But that, I think, is the biggest the risk for them.
Madeline.
So on legal migration, I don't foresee any sort of massively new, exciting thing for the 2020s. I think in some ways what's interesting is that the pendulum swings, right? And it seems like the historical memory is quite short. And so, we introduced post-study work, we closed post-study work, we introduced post-study work. We'll probably do the same thing on salary thresholds. And it seems we're sort of swinging from one direction to the other. I wonder whether there will ever be a sort of anything like a stable middle ground. I suspect probably not.
Eric.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I'll just come back a little on with Damien. I mean, I don't know what you mean by populist. I mean, is reducing immigration to 100,000 populist or not? I mean, I guess that's sort of what I'm talking. I'm not talking about zero. I'm not talking about abusing people. But I think if you look at, for example, Brexit voters and you know, who've defected since 2019 from the Tory party, I mean, that is the group that the Tories need to win back now. Whereas if you take a, you know, cutting taxes and reducing public services, only 7% of British voters support that position. And so the economic libertarian position is extremely unpopular, whereas reducing immigration is very popular. Now, it seems to me in political marketing, you want to be going to where most of your voters are. Now, it doesn't mean you kind of cut it to zero, but especially when migration numbers aren't going to affect your economics very much, you know, your headline growth and productivity numbers very much. It doesn't seem an especially painful trade-off, in my view, to move in that direction. Again, calmly. If you look at, you look at Europe, it's populist right parties sort of led on this issue. The center-right parties, like in Sweden, followed to some extent. They didn't go as crazy, but that's sort of what I'm talking about. And again, you know, in New Zealand, in the United States, immigration has been an issue, you know, as well. So I just think, I don't know, if the idea is that you're going to go not worry about immigration and go towards, or I wouldn't say not worry about it, but go towards numbers like we've been seeing. I just don't think that's workable for the Tory coalition. But I could be wrong, and you know.
Right, we have just over 15 minutes for some questions. The team will go around with a mic. Please don't speak till you have the mic. Please say your name, and if you're from an organisation, can you please say it? I'm going to take a couple at a time. And just by way of housekeeping, can I please recommend, and plead in fact, that you keep the question thoughtful, respectful, short, and can it please not be, why won't the government do anything about it? Because we're here to think about this question in a more sophisticated way of looking at solutions. Right in front of you, Lena.
Robin Hodgson from the House of Lords, where say you actually restrict immigration at all is like denying existence of God 200 or 300 years ago, where we've been struggling with the illegal migration bill till 4 o'clock in the morning. It seems to me the debate has become unbalanced because the two most vocal groups are both in favour. What I might call the moral case, we owe it to people less fortunate than ourselves, and the economic case, running along the lines that Professor Manning's been talking about. What we've forgotten about, of course, is that 60 and 70% of people in this country think it is overcrowded. And that is a feature that in various ways it affects their lives, about housing, about declining wildlife, about a shortage of food and water, lack of access to health and education. And therefore, could I suggest that one of the ways for the government to do this would be to try and turn the issue on its head and have something like an Office for Population Sustainability, an Office for Demographic Change, which would include what the MAC does, and actually enable the unheard, who have many, many, many concerns about this, a chance to know that their concerns are being discussed, looked at, analysed in an open-handed way, and that the Office for Demographic Change would report to Parliament every year, and there would be a debate and people would know that something was being done.
Thank you very much. At the back, sir.
Thank you. Angel Valdez. So I think it was Warwick and Cambridge that said that up to 2 million jobs will be replaced by automation by 2035 or something like that. So I think, obviously, the jobs that are going to be most affected by that are what we call low-skilled jobs. And then sectors like healthcare are going to see increases in demand because of an ageing population. So I'm just wondering, what does that mean for immigration figures, but also what does that mean for sort of the cultural questions around how we perceive migration in terms of what jobs and sectors will need most jobs and what sectors and jobs will suffer the most number of losses?
Okay, who would like to take the first of those? Anybody? Anyone like to speak for or against an OBR for immigration, an independent non-party political Whitehall institution or Prague or something like that. Eric, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I think it is a great idea, actually, because ultimately these things need to be planned for. So, for example, if you want to make structural economic changes to make your economy less dependent on short-term migration flows, then you'll have to train more medical nurses, for example. You're going to have to change maybe the career structure, work on mechanization, or some. I mean, you're going to have to make those economic structural changes in order to allow yourself to wean yourself off that immigration-dependent model. So, which I think feeds nicely into what Robin was saying, really, about just planning for all these things. I think it makes sense because in a way these things aren't joined up. You know, the migration side and the economic side, the services planning. I think it could all be usefully integrated. So, yeah, vote in favor.
Madeline, what do you think on that?
I think, I guess the key challenge is then specifying what the objective is. It's very difficult to work out, you know, what is the right amount of population for a country like the UK, and you know how we should use the amount of space we have. I think sometimes population density measures are a little bit simplistic because it's sort of, you know, if we annexed Greenland, our population density would go down, but it wouldn't necessarily affect what it's like to live here. So a lot of it is more about how you use the space, and there are places that have very high population density and places that have much lower population density. But I think, you know, so you would have to, I don't know that you could necessarily have a sort of, you know, experts say this is the right population for the UK and this is how you get there. Of course, you can have experts consider the components of, you know, specific things like housing or infrastructure, or, you know, given a certain level of population, how would you plan for that? Appears to me to be a much more manageable task than saying sort of what is the right population for the UK, which I think would be incredibly difficult.
Just on the second question, so yours was on measurement, was it? Just want to repeat it very briefly.
Both the effect of automation on numbers in terms of work, immigration, but also the perceptions in terms of cultural perspectives that that might entail based on what sectors are going to be most effective.
So what is the impact of automation going to be on certain sectors, and how's that going to be received? Maybe that's one for you, Alan.
I would say, first of all, believe those numbers even less than you believe people talk about the impacts of immigration. I think a bit over 10 years ago, there was a study that said 40% of jobs were going to be automated within a decade or two. It was very, very influential. People were very worried about it. We're halfway through that decade or two, and we're talking about labour shortages. So I think, although technology always changes the sorts of jobs that people do, and you've got to be able to facilitate, you know, be flexible enough to do that, it doesn't have adverse, you know, it doesn't affect the total amount of work that's done at all. I think, again, that's one of the things that I think the implications for immigration are not very big, you know, one way or the other. I mean, it's an important issue, but it's sort of separate from immigration, and immigration hasn't got much to do with it, and that it hasn't got much to do with immigration.
Do you want to add anything to that, Damien?
I mean, economic history bears that out, that actually people are forever worried about automation, and as long as you have a dynamic capitalist system, you will always create new jobs. I mean, the other point I would make is that in the short term, it's quite likely not to be what we think of as quite low-skilled jobs that will go. It will be sort of middle-level jobs, that things like AI, for example, will be aimed at. You will always need a care worker to actually physically help someone out of a chair. You can do what you like with technology, but actually you need human beings for certain types of jobs. And so I suspect, but it is all slightly up in the air, we're all guessing here, that the next generation of massive technological advance will take away a swathe of middle-level jobs rather than jobs at the top or the bottom. And they will be replaced by some other middle-level jobs in industries we've not yet dreamed of.
A couple more. Alp. Wait to the microphone now.
Alp Mehmet, Chairman of Migration Watch. What can I say? Such a stellar panel, as they might say on GB News, with whom I agree almost entirely. A couple of things I don't agree with. Damien, I remember lots of discussions in your office when you were the first immigration minister under Theresa May in 2010, when you convinced me that it was all possible, that it was going to be possible to bring it down to below 100,000, and indeed lots of progress made, as you've pointed to. So my question to you would be, what went wrong? If I might just add to that, with regard to Madeleine, can I disagree with her? The only point that I really did take issue with was this business that immigration, net migration would fall back to the sort of average levels that we had over the past 13 years. It won't. It can't. That's impossible. And I'm afraid that whether it happens or not does matter, simply because planning now, if the OBR is to be believed, and they are assuming net migration of 250,000 or thereabouts soon, all the planning that goes into producing our schools and our hospitals and our doctors and whatever is based on that. That's why it's important that we get it right. And politicians, I'm afraid, if they take, as we are probably doing tonight, how does the Conservative Party win the next general election or do less badly in the next general election? How does Labour counter all that? Everything is short term, and the problem is that even short term solutions actually have long term impact, and that's what the Conservative Party should now be looking at.
And sir, in the red top just there. As brief as possible and a question, please.
Yes, I'm Antonino Uviero, I'm in property. I have a policy when reading about the housing crisis or housing, if the writer doesn't mention immigration, to disregard in toto the entire article. So congratulations on the panel for discombobulating me by talking about nothing but immigration and not mention housing except after the Q&A. The question is for Eric, who played down economic factors, played up cultural factors. With the housing crisis and how that affects household formation, how can you hold to that view, especially in your background in demographics?
So we have a question on housing, impact on housing demand, and then a sort of a what went wrong from ALP, and that things are going to get worse because migration of a certain level is baked into OBR predictions about the future. Any views on that? Eric, do you want to start? Or you were challenged directly on housing, so why don't you have the right of
Oxford
reply?
University No, but I really don't see these. Of course, they are connected in reality. The more immigration you get, more pressure on housing. Hard to keep up with that. So I'm agreeing with you in reality. But in terms of attitudes, if you take young people, they're the most pro-immigration and they're the most worried about housing. They don't seem to put these two things together at all. Exactly. But that's what I'm saying is these two attitude spheres are heavily disconnected. So worry about housing isn't what's driving worry about immigration is what I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that immigration doesn't affect housing. It does, right? But for voters, they're thinking of these realms in largely separate ways, I would say. Now, if you happen to be a restrictionist, then you will say, aha, the reason we've got this problem with housing is because of immigration. But if you are a liberal, immigration liberal, that won't even factor at all in your view. And that's why I think, so the older population, which is less concerned about housing, is more concerned about immigration, and vice versa. It doesn't make a lot of sense. You'd have thought if one was driving the other, then we should see these two things correlated much more in the opinion data. So that would be my answer to you on that.
So that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not a causative link in economic reality.
Of course,
but it just means that people perceive it in accordance with their pre-existing.
In public opinion, it's very much inflected by ideological priors. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Any other views on that? Damien?
I was going to answer Alp's direct question to me. What went wrong? Well, I mean, as you say, when we came in 2010, net migration was something like 260,000, and when I left office, moved over to be police minister, it was 163,000. So the flip answer is I wasn't immigration minister anymore, so not my fault. The more serious answer was a Eurozone crisis, which meant that getting a job as a young person in Spain or Italy became extremely difficult. And so basically they all tipped up in London to work here, and the numbers started going the other way. And then there was a sort of pause during the Brexit debate where, as I think Eric made the very good point, that half the Brexit campaign was we're going to be Singapore on terms, we're going to be massively economically liberal, aimed at one part of the population, and the other half was Nigel Farage saying, actually, we're going to stop all these foreigners coming here. And you could choose which to believe, and enough people believe both that they won a majority. But one or other side of the Brexit argument was always going to be betrayed. And it was the Faragists who were betrayed, because nobody, I think, at the heart of the Vote Leave movement ever believed that, or thought that more economic liberalism would be the answer that would sweep away all the issues over immigration. And so the promises made in the Brexit campaign were themselves impossible to meet, and because of contingent things that's happened since the pandemic, like the war in Ukraine and so on, and the aftermath of Hong Kong, means we are now at a historically high level. So I'm not sure I agree that it can't possibly go back to previous levels. It can go back. It may or may not, but I'm absolutely sure it will go back. That this will be a historic high point. Net 600,000.
We've got time for just a couple more. Let's go with Henry and Poppy. Henry, you first.
Henry Hill, Deputy Editor of Conservative Home. Is there a case for using the shortage occupation system to make businesses invest more in training? So over the past couple of decades, it seems like businesses have really managed to externalise an awful lot of the cost of training. Universities overproduce graduates, businesses hire the best, the Treasury and young workers pay the bill in higher marginal tax rates, or the Treasury picks up the tab that don't pay it off. And then, if that's not enough, they can spend a month rummaging around under the back of the sofa and declare that they've done everything they possibly could to try and find higher skilled workers, and that they need it to be declared a shortage occupation. So could you not say, okay, if you get a shortage occupation declaration, it'll be for 5 years or 10 years, it'll be tapered, and you have to use that time to invest in a domestic training and skills pipeline, so that by the end of that process, you are not reliant on immigrant workers anymore.
Thanks very much, and let's go over to the back.
Hi. It's quite interesting to have been on this panel to see that it's not too fatalistic. I think these discussions do tend to be quite fatalistic, and I think probably understandably so. Even if we just look at the example of what Scott Robin's been coming up against, the people who are stopping this campaign of what she said she wants to reduce legal migration aren't necessarily kind of blob activists from the outside, but people from within different departments of government. And I think this is part of the problem. I think the idea of kind of unified, migration-focused department does make a lot of sense in terms of no, we are just for reducing migration. But I think it's also important to make sure that we're keeping in mind that the job of government isn't expectation management, it's to actually get these things done. So it's not a case of saying, there's nothing that can be done because of this reason, the Treasury won't allow it, and the Department for Education needs the money from the international students. There are still serious consequences that we haven't really touched upon at all tonight that come from mass inward migration, which is to say, integration is almost impossible when it's coming into highly concentrated urban areas. And this is something that Britain has prided itself on for the last couple of years. And I think the Leicester riots last year were a really good example of the sort of thing I think we will be seeing in the next couple of decades, which is to say we will be seeing inter-ethnic conflict between communities which have just not been integrated because there's been no attempt and really no possibility of doing so. So I think it's important that we, bear in mind that this is not like a fringe position. This is the moderate position. Actually, net zero migration, that's not like a crazy, far away, impossible thing to do. This is something that we should be seriously considering as the best case option. 100,000 net migration should be seen as something that's actually pretty out there. So yeah, I just think it's having a sense of proportion and scale for the long term, and not just be thinking purely in short term, putting out fires for this kind of issue.
Let's answer those backwards. So first of all, we've got, it's not that extreme a position to argue for very low net migration, or much lower than it is now, and the current levels may pose problems in terms of social integration because of the scale and the rate. Eric, do you want to come on that, and then we'll go to Henry's question after?
Yeah, I would say the thing about migration is it's cumulative. It's happening every year. You know, in the case of the US, they had maybe 1 million people crossing the border every year for decades. And then you see things like 12 million people illegal. You see the Hispanic population go from maybe 2% up to larger than the African Americans at 17, and a majority in certain cities like Los Angeles. So this change is cumulative in the, obviously if you have ethnic assimilation, then that reduces the diversity level. But if that doesn't occur, then it can build up over time and create whole new voting blocks. I think it's, rather than interethnic conflict, I think we're more likely to see deeper and deeper polarization in the majority population between the people who like diversity and want more of it and the people who want less of it. And that's, I think, more of what we're seeing. I don't worry as much about the interethnic conflict, I accept that can happen, but I think this polarization is going to deepen trust and some of what Robert Putnam talks about, the kind of hollowing out of social capital and cohesion. I think that's more likely what we're going to see. So it's all about thinking long term and on the cumulative effects of every year having hundreds and hundreds of thousands.
And as a policy wonk, I'd like to finish on a proposal. So Henry's brilliant idea of should we restrict shortage occupations to a sort of delineated thing, which then tapers off, and there's an obligation to train. Could there be any mileage in such a scheme? Either of you want to come in on that?
I'm going to say, I'm afraid, I understand where that's coming from. I don't actually think that would work for two reasons. I think the shortage, as I said earlier, shortages are actually, everyone says they're about skills. They're much less than about skills than actually people are claiming. This is sort of tried a bit in the past with a sort of sunset clause. You're going on the shortage occupation list. You have a few years to sort yourself out. Of course, you get to those few years, nobody has sorted it out.
Well, that's why you have a mandatory thing that you have to do.
Yeah, but that, in practice, what that meant was you're going to say to the, I mean, because the NHS was the worst offender on this, and the government's the worst offender on this, that you're suddenly not going to have any nurses. And, you know, at that point, that's going to have real consequences for people's lives. I would actually get rid of the shortage occupation list. I think it's, you know, the MAC wanted to get rid of it because it only made sense when you had a quota on numbers as a way of prioritising when that you were over that quota. It really shouldn't be called the shortage occupation list. It's sort of jobs that, it's now basically jobs that you think employers should be able to bring in migrants, but the sort of general salary threshold of 26,000 is too high to be realistic for them. That's basically what it's for. So calling it the shortage occupation list is not really what it is, a terrible name. But the government, because it's from an economic perspective, it's perverse. You think a job is in shortage, and you respond to that. You think the market should respond by putting upward pressure on wages. The consequence within our migration system is to lower wages, and that was a government decision. That was, the MAC was totally opposed to that. But the government, for some reason, thought that was a good idea.
I was really hoping that was going to be a eureka moment, but clearly the complexity of the issue is large and escapes us, and far more than we can nail down in this evening. So many more things for us to be reading and thinking about on this very important question. We are out of time, I'm afraid, so can I thank all of you for coming along. I usually like to thank my panel of speakers at the beginning and at the end, and shamefully I forgot, so can we please give them all an extra loud round of applause for their contributions. Please do continue to look out for more information about the Future of Conservatism event series and our upcoming report, which will be launched at some point over the summer. Please do subscribe to the Onward mailing list to find out all that Onward is doing. This will be available after this on YouTube. If you have any friends, relatives, loved ones, relations, friends, people who are particularly interested in immigration who might want to go away and watch it. But thank you very much for your time and have a wonderful evening.